All right. Hey, we're glad to have you here with us once again on our Monday evening as we look into our next Parsha. We're at almost, I don't know quite if we're in the middle of the book of Numbers or certainly somewhere about halfway through the different Parshas for this particular segment. And tonight we're going to be looking at Parsha Korach, which is Numbers chapter 16 through chapter 18. And I think it's interesting, Ben, as we ended last week's Parsha, we saw Moses, the Lord speaking to Moses and telling the Israelites to construct certain fringes around the corners of their garments. And he tells them so that they will not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful urge. And I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord your God. And so it ends with this idea that, hey, don't be chasing after what your eyes see and your sort of heart wants from a lustful situation. And then we get into chapter 16 and we have what I know for most of us is probably a pretty well-known event. But all of a sudden, we see this played out on a pretty grand scale in many ways, and that is about what happens with Korach and how he and some others decide that they're going to challenge Moses and Aaron, and what that leads to.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he's following his heart, and it's leading him the wrong way. It's pretty serious rebellion. I mean, there's been grumbling before, but this is, and they've rebelled. I mean, they were getting ready to stone Moses and Aaron, but this is, it seems almost organized and pretty serious. And, you have verse 1, now Korach, and then you have Datan, Aviram, and then On, and then verse 2, they rose up in the face of Moses, with certain of the children of Israel, 250 men. So I don't think this happened, like in the space of, 15 minutes. It's probably been brewing, and Rashi says that Korach's tent would have been by the tent of the sons of Reuben. So same neighborhood, maybe.
And it might follow. I mean, I'm not quite sure we know the time frame, but it seems that it might follow on the heels of the 12 going into the land to spy out the land, and then coming back. And as you said, we sort of have this rebellion from the people listening to the 10 versus the 2. And now we see this again, another type of rebellion playing out with these individuals.
Yeah, I mean, it fits in here. And the rabbis say, Torah is not necessarily chronological, but it is to be viewed as chronological unless there is good reason to take it as not chronological. And Rashi and Rambam, two rabbis, argue over exactly when this happened, but I think they both come up with the same idea in a sense, because Rashi says it just follows chronologically after the disaster of the spies, and it, it follows in the text that way. And that is a terrible time, because Moses is not now, the most popular guy, and Aaron either, because of that. And Ramban says that it may follow chronologically, but he would even date it earlier, after the completion of the tabernacle, and that Korach, who is Moses and Aaron's cousin, and he wants or thinks that he should be priest. And Ramban says, it may be even that if he had that problem right after the tabernacle is completed, and Aaron, and you remember all that pomp and circumstance, and yet you couldn't speak against Moses because everybody loved Moses. But now some things have happened, and it may be an opportunity for him to step in and say this. So, in the text, it follows chronologically after that disaster of the spies.
But you could see if it's one or the other, or if it's a continuation. This is going on for a while.
Yeah, I don't think it's something overnight.
Right, just didn't happen overnight, and it's been brewing for some time, and it seems as if it's not just one man, uh, or even if it is just one man, that it does spread to at least 250 other individuals. Again, all except for the three that you mentioned earlier, seemingly within the tribe of Levi. So within his sort of own house, this resentment, this frustration seems to be spreading, I don't know, fairly quickly.
Yeah, fairly quickly, and it may be instructive to us, of how quickly such things may spread. And we're part of congregations, and it's you all of us may have some stories to tell in that regard. But Korach is the leader, it seems, along with Datan and Abiram. In the NIV, the last word in verse 1 of chapter 16 is insolent. He became insolent. And that's an interpretation. The Hebrew just says he took. Maybe he took himself. Some understand that he took men, but it's whatever. However it's to be understood. I think the idea is he is taking the initiative against Moses and Aaron.
Yeah, and as we're going to see that it certainly has ramifications, and it's interesting what Korach says to Moses and Aaron. At least I think so. In the Jewish Study Bible, and I think in a few English translations, it says something like "You've gone too far."
Yeah.
Right, and I think the implication being is you've exceeded whatever mandate God has given you. You've pushed your leadership further than it should be, and we're paying the price of that. And so Moses, has to respond in some way.
Yeah, you have that phrase at the end of verse 3, and it says, "You great to you," or something, or "You've gone," or "far to you." You have gone too far. And then Moses turns around and uses that in verse 7 against them, and he says, "You've gone too far, you sons of Levi." And again, we're not exactly sure who all's involved in this. We have Korach, who is a Levite, and then you have these two, Datan, Aviram, and On. And On vanishes, and we'll talk about, why the rabbis suggest he does that, or how he does that. So you have Korach, Datan, Aviram, and On, and Datan, Aviram, and On are of the tribe of Reuben. So we have Korach, a Levite, and then these three from the tribe of Reuben. And then we're not told where those 250 are from, but in verse 7, Moses says, "You sons of Levi." He says the same thing in verse 8. So some of those in the 250 must have been Levites.
Yeah.
So it's spreading. It's becoming very, very serious. And Moses turns the words around and he says, "You've gone too far."
Well, I think it sets up a nice sort of, I don't know if contest is the right word. That contest seems to diminish it a little bit, but in some ways, I suppose it is about who's going to be chosen by God. It's interesting for me when I read this that they choose the incense and the offering of this incense to sort of be the test of who God is going to choose. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on why Moses might have chosen this, or why this might have been chosen as sort of the test for who God's going to ultimately elevate.
Yeah, well, I don't have any personal observations, but the rabbis had some observations. One thing before that, in verse 5, Moses says, "In the morning we'll do this," and he's, I think, trying to postpone them, gain some time, and maybe they'll, they'll just put this out of their mind. Maybe it's a bad day for them. I don't know. But, he says in the morning.
Maybe they'll come to their senses after they've slept on it.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the incense or the fire, that's God has authorized incense. He's offering fire. And so Moses says, here's a service God desires, but it has the potential of death. And we've seen strange fire or incense that Nadav and Abihu offered, and they died. But Moses is saying it's an opportunity and it's a challenge for you. You can prove yourself if this incense is accepted, but if not, you can expect to die. And I think, being the leader that he is, Moses hopes that they'll just, it's raised the level of this pretty quickly here and seriously. It's not like we're going to go around and take a poll from the people and vote and all this stuff to see. We're going to bring this to God, and here is the test. And God will decide who are his and who is holy. And he says it depends on this incense, this fire. And if not, in verse 7, then it doesn't say if not in verse 7, but if not, then they will die.
In the English translations, it said, you have gone too far. But I know you and I talked earlier that in the Hebrew, it seems to say something like, it is too much for you. Is that correct? And then if that is, what does that imply?
Well, it's the same phrase as in verse 3. It is too much for you. So Korach says to Moses and Aaron, you take too much upon you. It is too much for you. And then Moses turns that around in verse 7 and says, it is too much for you, sons of Levi. And some say he means to the Levites that you've gone too far, and that might be the meaning. Others suggest he's telling them, is it not enough that you Levites have the great honor of serving, and then you want to do this?
Yeah, I think he said, as we read it here, and as you just said in verse 9, is it not enough for you that God set you apart to perform the duties of the tabernacle? And then verse 10, do you seek the priesthood as well?
Yeah.
Right. How much of this do you want? I think that, again, sort of plays back into, as we were saying to open our Parsha, with the idea that, our heart and our eyes see something maybe more than what we should be seeing. We start being jealous for it. We start seeking it out. And obviously, I think we start to sin and particularly, as you just said, God's elevated them in many ways as being with the tribe of Levi to a very important position. And it's like, how much isn't that good enough for you to be blessed?
Apparently it's not for Korach. And the rabbis sometimes, they say maybe his desire was good, but it became sinful. He wanted to be a priest so he could have that intimate fellowship, but God has said, you're not the high priest. Aaron is the high priest. And so to go against God, and it's almost, I wonder what he thought that night before. He's waiting, how's this going to turn out? Did he believe that God had set apart Aaron as priest, as high priest? If he believed that God did that, then I wonder, what does he think's going to happen the next day?
But suppose if he thought that Moses had done it, and there is some, I don't know if we'll talk about it here or later on, but there is some idea that, they're attributing a lot of what's happening to Moses and Aaron, but to Moses, right? So whether or not it's God who's actually doing it. So if Moses has done it, then Moses is just some other man. Yeah. And what makes him all that important? and his authority could be usurped. But certainly we know, obviously, that it's the Lord who set him apart. But that's a good question. What did he understand that evening before that fateful morning? And if he did know that it was God, what was it that he thought he could overturn God's word with?
Yeah. And I mean, those are good points. And it may be that the reason this is so serious and it had such a serious outcome is to doubt Moses' authority is to doubt God's authority. And it puts everything that Moses has taught, and said into question. And so maybe that's why it has to be handled the way that it is. I mean, it's even, whether they mean it or not, it's trying to give a revisionist spin on some history. I mean, they're even later, saying that Egypt was a land of milk and honey, the land of promise.
I was just about to get to that because as you mentioned, from the beginning, it talks about Dathan and Abiram. And we've heard from Korah now. We've heard sort of Moses speaking to Korah. Now Moses is going to send for those two, and they're going to say, no, we're not coming. And then, is it not enough that you brought us up from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, that you would also lord it over us? And then verse 14, which I think is kind of interesting, given particularly if this does follow after the spies going into the land and knowing that they brought back, the fruit and the honey and so forth. Even if you had brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey and given us possession of fields and vineyards, should you gouge out those men's eyes, we will not come. And it's like, man, if you just saw this from the spies coming back, the whole congregation was assembled, and you're saying, well, even if you give us that land, it's like, well, that's where you're going. You're going to the land, but and you came from a land of milk and honey because you benefited from all those fruits of the laborers, right? The slaves. And you talk about a revisionist history. Yeah.
And I mean, Dathan and Abiram, when Moses calls them, it's a little bit stronger than they're saying, no, we don't want to come up. They're saying, come, we shall not come up. And Rashi says they uttered an unwitting prophecy because they won't go up. What they're going to do is go down, and they go into the ground in the pit, and they're even the manner in which they're speaking, and they come out, and some of the rabbis say that they would be even cursing Moses. And that, what does it mean? If you'll gouge out the eye, some say that's literal. There's nothing you can do to make us come, but others say it's figurative, in that you may cover up the eyes of everybody else to hide and mask, your failures as a leader, but you won't pull it over on us. So we're not coming up.
We're not blind to your failings.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Of course, it's their interpretation to say that they're failings to begin with.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, nobody else is saying that Moses and Aaron have failed.
Yeah.
Just these.
Yeah. At this point. Yeah. And verse 15, Moses is very angry. And so, he says to the Lord, don't respect their offering. I haven't taken anything from them. I haven't hurt one of them. And even says he didn't even take a donkey. And Rashi understands that and says he sent a donkey to get his family to bring them from Midian to Egypt. And he wasn't reimbursed for that. He could have been, but he wasn't reimbursed. Whether it means that, I don't know. But he's saying, I'm not profiting from this. I mean, if you'd ask Moses, do you want to continue leading, or do you want to go home? Most times, most days, he would say, I'll go home.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
So,
the mantle of leadership weighs pretty heavy at times, and
Yeah.
certainly amongst these group of people who for 40 years were complaining the way they did. So, it's as we move through the story, I guess Moses, this is still the night before, because Moses is going to say to Korah, tomorrow, you and all yours are going to come up and you're going to offer. But then he also says Aaron is also going to bring your fire pans. So he's like telling Aaron at the same time that this is where I guess a little bit more of the idea of a contest or demonstration, right? And Aaron's also going to be a part of this. It's not just going to be you, Korah, succeed or fail. It's going to be showing Aaron's a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, throughout with this and the rods, the budding of the rod, the staffs, it is determining who God has chosen. And some have said, if Aaron is not there, then and they offer their fire, then they could have said, well, there's no response from God, because it might have been the same with Aaron. And so Aaron is in this as well. I mean, they might say, well, we offered our fire and no response from God, so that doesn't mean we're charlatans. But if Aaron had done it, God might not have responded to him as well. So here you have Aaron beside these ones who are offering.
Outside of the event of the golden calf, Aaron is generally seen pretty favorably, and is looked upon even here favorably. We're going to see that when he eventually does die, he gets an extended period of mourning, which I don't think they would have done had they not seen him as favorably. But that's a good question you raise. Aaron's got to be somehow thinking to himself, look, my sons are dead because of what we're going through right now, offering the incense, right? And so Aaron has got to himself be not only prepared, but also it seems like ensuring that he is living the way that God calls him to live, and that he is doing the things according to God's will. And again, he's not always been the most faithful and true, but generally pretty good. But I just got to wonder what's going through his mind a little bit.
And here's another thing. I mean, when Moses says, this is what Korach and his company are to do, so verse 4, Moses fell on his face and he spoke to them and he said, you do this and you offer this fire. Throughout this, and I'm not doubting that God told Moses this, but throughout this, you don't have it in the text that God told Moses, okay, here's what you do. And there could have been in the back of the mind of Aaron, is Moses coming up with this, or is this from God? So if it's like, Aaron's two sons, it could be all of us are going to die in the morning if this is not the way to settle this. But I do think and we don't know. I mean, God could have communicated with Aaron as well, Aaron and Moses, about this, that this was what he would be pleased with, because it's a serious thing, because, the two sons died because of the strange fire.
And I think it's interesting is, again, we read so much back into the text, but these are got to be salient moments in the history of the Israelites when you are, even if it's of an offshoot of only a few in comparison to a large number of people, when you're calling into question the leadership of God's people. When it says, as you just mentioned, back up in verse 5, he will grant access to the one he has chosen. All along it's been God has chosen Moses and God has chosen Aaron, and with the events that have happened, the people got to be sitting back going, this is going to be interesting, right? I mean, you make an assumption. We might make an assumption that it's going to work out favorably, but that's us maybe reading back into it. But still, I think that people would have been interested to see how this is going to turn out.
Yeah, and they have a part to play in it, because in verse is it verse 21? They are called to 16:21, separate. Then this is what the Lord says: separate from this assembly, so I can put an end to them at once. That appears to me to be the Israelites. Well, up to this point, it's like Korach has started this rebellion along with other people, and now God says to Moses and Aaron, move back, separate yourself, and I will consume this congregation. And then you have to ask, how are they involved in this?
Well, it's not the first time God has told Moses and Aaron, particularly Moses, I just start over again. I'll just, he'll say it another time or two at least. I'm tired of all this grumbling. I'm tired of the way people are treating me.
But it would be easier if you had at the beginning of the text, all of the congregation grumbled against Moses and they sent Korach. What we have is some of the congregation grumbling, and then God says, I'm going to destroy the whole congregation.
Yeah.
And so the rabbis wrestle with that, and they come to the conclusion, which I think is the right conclusion, is the congregation has to come down on one side or the other in support of leadership. One thing real quick about on in verse 12. So you have the beginning of the chapter, on, O-N, that's his name, is a part of this. And then in verse 12, Moses sent to call Datan and Abiram. He's already spoken to Korah. Now he calls Datan and Abiram. From here on, I mean, where's On? He's
off.
Yeah, he's off, I guess. The rabbis say that his wife was wise and righteous, and she talked to him when he got involved in this, and she said, what do you have to gain from this foolishness? You need to stop this. And she even says, even if Korach wins, then he'll be high priest, and you'll be subservient to him, just as you are now to Moses and Aaron. What are you gaining out of this? And so we don't know, but I do know he's absent. It's silent about him from after verse 1.
Yeah, that is.
Maybe he, that night he got to thinking about it. I'm not going to be there.
But we're not told how many other from the tribe of Reuben might have participated beyond these three. But we do know that Reuben was not the favored son. He was the oldest, firstborn, should have been. But once again, was relegated sort of down the ladder because of various actions, not only of Reuben, but also of his descendants. And then this, again, just sort of plays into that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, Korach could have even used that in his propaganda.
One thing that we talked about sort of how people act, how people respond to these challenges, to these situations. It's interesting that Moses does what Moses does, right? So you said he fell down on his face. He's fallen down also before God, and he does what he's been doing from the beginning, and that is he's interceding on behalf of the people. When he probably is be like, yeah, I'm with you, God, just get rid of all of them. I've had enough. But are you going to allow the sin of one, presuming this being Korach, you're going to allow the sin of one to be the downfall for and take your wrath out on the whole community? He's interceding, and then he tells the other people, you need to withdraw from these people, and in essence, distance yourselves.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the idea that God is going, he says, separate from the congregation, that I may just consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces, Moses and Aaron, and said, and they appealed to God. But let me read a little bit. This is from Rabbi Joseph Rudensky, and he said, God at first wanted to destroy the entire Jewish people. The entire congregation was guilty of a terrible sin. They had committed the sin of fence straddling, the sin of indifference. True, they hadn't supported Korach, but they hadn't opposed him either. They'd adopted a wait and see attitude. If Moses wins, then that's well and good. They continue to work with him. But if Korach should win, then well and good. They'd work with him. They're guilty of not opposing what they knew to be wrong. They saw their community being threatened, but they didn't want to get involved. For this, God wanted to destroy them for condoning evil. And so if they want to be saved, then they have to actively disassociate themselves from the evil about them. And so they have to remove themselves from the tents or the dwellings of
Yeah, which is what Moses is telling them to do.
Yeah.
And some may not, as we see a little bit later on. But one thing that we looked at, I know I thought we just hit up on this because it's kind of interesting. I don't think I'm getting ahead of myself, but this idea that the words that are used for moving away from the tents or the abodes of Korach and his fellow compatriots is could have a meaning other than just their physical tent, right?
Yeah, that's in verse 24. You get up from the dwellings of Korach, Datan, and Abiram. And that is the Hebrew word mishkan. Mishkan means a dwelling, but it's used of the tabernacle. It would be Mishkan in English. And one Chumash or commentary says it is possible, and it's just a possibility, it's possible that Korach had already erected a competing sanctuary or a competing tabernacle. And the Septuagint, we were talking about the Septuagint. How did they translate it as tabernacle?
So they referenced the King James Version, which said tabernacle, but they also, interlinear said it was the word for tabernacle. And,
Mishkan. Yeah,
Mishkan. And anyway, I'm not trying to push the point, but in our English translations, at least the more modern ones, we don't really get that option. And I mean, that really would have been taking this pretty far had Korach and others actually set up some type of alternate place of worship. But
I don't know, probably the text means it's just their tents, but there is this possibility from the Chumash. And, when would they do that over the overnight when Moses says, so.
No, but again, if we talk the idea that perhaps this has been brewing for some time, and we don't know, again, it is speculation, but had they done something to anything to draw away from the tabernacle from the presence of the Lord, again, it just sort of compounds just how bad this is. So when God's saying, I want to get rid of the whole nation, and Moses saying, oh, you know the hearts of men, you could just get rid of one or two. And I'm going to get rid of all of them. Right. Yeah. And so maybe there, like you said, this idea that there's more to it than just what amounts to a small group of people challenging the authority, but that this has been pervasive, and then others have allowed not only fence sitting or, indifference, but, perhaps even allowed someone else outside of what God has commanded to, if not fully worship, at least begin the process of setting themselves up as high priest in an alternate system.
Yeah, and whatever it is a point of the people making a decision. Who are you with? And it's a physical separation, because you are close to these people, you're going to die. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and we talked about the fact that Moses says move away, and in verse 26 as we're getting to, and And in fact, some do, which then sets up, again, bringing back Datan and Aviram back into the picture, along with their families.
Yeah, there's a physical separation here, and the rabbis discuss back and forth. I mean, God is God. Could he not kill one person standing beside another person? He could do that. Why this? Well, it may be more of the idea of you make a decision and you physically separate yourself from these people. You depart from the tents of these wicked men. And so there is a separation. You have Korach, Datan, Aviram on one side, and Datan and Aviram come out with defiance. Erect is the idea, and they're probably cursing and taunting Moses, show him no respect. And then we're told all the people with Korach are swallowed up by the ground. But an interesting thing is, we talked about this in Numbers 26:11, that it explicitly says that the sons of Korach were not killed in this.
You know, we sort of got away, and I apologize if I took us down a rabbit hole a little bit, but, you know, we talk about tomorrow that's going to happen, and it's sort of lost whether or not the text actually says, and now this happened. Because he tells, here's what's going to happen tomorrow, and each of you are going to take this back in 17, take your fire pan, lay incense on it, et cetera, et cetera. Aaron's going to do the same thing. And in 18, and we do seem to jump ahead to tomorrow, because they do this, and Korach gathered the whole community against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting. It's like all of a sudden you kind of get lost in the actual offering of the incense, because all of a sudden you see the wrath of God, and you have this played out, and we're going to see Datan and Aviram and their families. You know, the Lord's going to set up this. Well, if the land opens up and swallows you up, that ought to be a sign. And lo and behold, here's the land opening up, and these are swallowed up. And I get the impression, it kind of struck me now as we're talking about it, this all just kind of comes rushing to a climax very quickly.
Yeah, you're right. And that's a good point, because it's like, here's what's going to happen tomorrow. And you have time, you can back out and you can stop all this. And then you don't have a statement that I can see that the next day this happened. It's verse 18, they took every man his fire pan, and Korach assembled his congregation. Another thing about Korach is in verse 19, Korach has a congregation. It's translated followers by the NIV, but it's Adah, or congregation, and that's used of the whole group of the Israelites. Their Adah, their congregation. And so Korach, and followers is not a literal translation of that. It's his congregation. He already has a congregation.
And so now we see perhaps that maybe it is more to just moving away from the abodes or dwelling places. Maybe it's moved away from everything associated with Korach, because he has not only maybe gathered these 250 men, but maybe gathered his own followers and who are recognizing him. And maybe that is more pervasive than just the 250. But either way,
250 is bad enough.
Yeah, there's going to be a plague, and the plague's going to come, and there's going to be a lot of people dead. And so, this is not only rushing to a quick dramatic ending, it's also very climactic in some ways when you see that how God exacts his punishment upon these individuals.
Yeah. I mean, verse 19 reads this way, and Korach assembled all the congregation against those at the tent of meeting. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. It appears like you have two congregations in that verse. You have Korach's congregation, and then you have the congregation. And the congregation is the bigger body of it's the children of Israel. And out of that, Korach has his congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the Lord speaking, separate, and Moses telling the people to separate. And then it finally plays out. The ground opens up and swallows Korach's, those men who are associated with Korach. Verse 32 doesn't say strictly that Korach was swallowed up in the ground. Some of the rabbis say he died in the fire that came down from heaven in verse 35. And maybe did, I don't know. But in Deuteronomy, where is that verse 11, verse 6, it is telling this again, and it says that Datan and Aviram were swallowed up. It doesn't mention Korach. Now, it doesn't mean that he wasn't. He either was swallowed up in the earth or he died in this fire.
So, as we're saying, this again sort of comes to this rushing conclusion. You've got the ground opening, you've got a number of these individuals who are being swallowed up. Then you have the fire that goes forth and consumes the 250 men offering the incense. So, obviously you've got some death going on, and then it's like it's over, right? And then you got chapter 17. Fascinating discussion. I'm trying to keep us moving along here.
Before we leave 16, let's talk about Korach's sons real quick.
Yes. And so I was going to mention. Well, you mentioned it's going to come back, and so you got these people dying, but yet, as we'll find out as we read in the Psalms, there are a number of sons of Korach who have written the Psalms.
Yeah, from that Numbers 26:11, Korach's children were not consumed here. And then you go to the book of Psalms, and you have several Psalms written by the sons of Korach. If you want to jot them down, or you can go back and rewatch this, or you could Google, but they're Psalm 42, 44 through 49, 84, and 87 and 88 are Psalms written by the sons of Korach. And it seems to be, a lesson there that you can learn, from a wicked father, or they overcame, whatever that was. And if it says later in Numbers that his sons were not killed, they had to make a stand. They're part of the Israelites, so they had to make a stand. And so there's a lot of backstory with all that going on, I think, that we're not told about.
Yeah, there is. And like we said, you've got this sort of coming to a conclusion now, and Moses is telling me, go out and pick up the copper pans, fire pans, because they're sacred. We're going to maybe not burn fire anymore, but we're going to use them on the altar. We're going to pound them out and use them, on the altar. But we have this sort of aftermath, right? And so we have chapter, and in the English translations and the Hebrew translations are a little off here. So the English translation, the first part of this continues chapter 16 for a number of verses before picking up 17, and then 17 in the Hebrew is a little bit longer. So by the time you get to chapter 18, it works itself out. So we apologize if the numbering system doesn't quite work out, but between the last part of chapter 16 through 17, you've got these copper fire pans being preserved. You've got the Israelites who are going to question their fate, and are punished by the plague. You've got the Levites confirmed in the test, as you mentioned earlier, of Aaron's rod. And then the idea of who's responsible for the temple and that sort of thing. And so all this kind of comes together in this last chapter on the heels of what Korach has done.
Yeah, you want to stop here and see if anybody has comments or questions on 16?
You wonder about Korah's children.
Yeah.
At that point. And, we kind of use when people say, well, why did God kill all of the babies and everything, in Canaan, that type of thing, and the people that were there and so forth. And I think it doesn't really say this, but we've said, well, God knows their heart, how evil they were and how it's going to be passed on to the I don't know whether we could apply it here to say God knows their heart and he willed that they be saved. He wanted to use them later.
Yeah. I mean,
it's all speculation on that thing. It's kind of hard to
where does it say? It says, where does it say? Yeah, their little ones, their wives and their little ones.
Yeah, it's verse 27.
Yeah, verse 27. And again, I can't answer for God. I'm not God. I'm going to leave it with him. And I will say this, the wives would have had to make their own decisions, and maybe they chose not to separate themselves. And the little ones, from the theology of Scripture, I would say would be innocent. And it may be that the wives and the parents are responsible for their physical death here because they died in this as well. So, and if you've studied Joshua, you have that problem. It's a problem that about the innocent and the babies, being ordered to be put to death. And it's going to leave that in God's hands. God is a gracious God. He's a loving God. And there's worse thing than physical death, and that is spiritual death. So.
Thanks, LaRue.
Yeah, LaRue, thank you. All right, well, we better get in. Anybody else?
We've got about 10 minutes, give or take, and I kind of want to hit just a couple of things. It's interesting that, again, and this is what I think is so remarkable about what we learn from the people of Israel, is that even on the heels, HEELS, of what's happening and what just happened, the people still are grumbling against Moses and Aaron in chapter 17, or what's last part of 16, depending on the translation. But the next day, the whole Israelite community railed against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You two have brought death upon the Lord's people." Right? And so they basically have to flee to the tabernacle where the presence of the Lord is, and God's telling them, "Hey, just remove yourself from all of. I want to annihilate them."
That's the second time in 2 chapters.
That's right, in a short span. I'm going to annihilate them all. And then what does Moses do?
And Moses does what he always does. He intercedes, and I mean, like you brought out, it's self-evident, but this should be amazing to us. I mean, if you had witnessed this whole episode with your own eyes, because if you separated yourself, you saw what happened over there, and the ground opened up, and it wasn't just an earthquake. The ground opened up, swallowed them alive, and the ground closed up. And that, if I'd have seen something like that, that'd be something I'd remember all of my life. And I don't know how much time has passed after this, verse 6, is it on the tomorrow? Or well, not verse 6, it's whatever the verse is in English. But it seems to be the next day.
Yeah.
Verse 41, the next day. So the day after this, they are complaining.
Right. And so, like you said, they've seen, even if they didn't physically all see it, you know, there was enough who physically saw it. So they saw the ground swallowing it up. They saw people dying in the fire, and yet they're still complaining and saying that you, Moses, never brought death to us. And God saying, remove yourself from this group. And then all of a sudden, next thing you have, boom, you got a plague going on.
Yeah.
Right. And so the people who are, again, grumbling against God as if they haven't seen what happens when you grumble. Now, God will let you complain. I mean, you can be mad at God. I fully believe, because you watch the psalmist going, you know, I can't believe you're doing this, God. Why? You can grieve and be upset, but it's obviously they've crossed this line and it's become sinful. And he's not going to put up with that. And so now there's a plague, and this plague again runs rampant. It's not just a few people.
Yeah, it's 14,700, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, they attribute the death of all, you know, of Natan and Abiru and Korach and the 250 to Moses and Aaron. So that tells you something right there, if they are attributing the death to Moses and Aaron.
Yeah.
So the plague is stopped through incense as well, and I think that's significant. It's showing that incense is not the killer. It depends on who's offering the incense, whether it's a unauthorized people or a lawful priest like Aaron. And so this whole thing, I think, is underscoring the idea that Aaron is the authorized, lawful, God-chosen high priest.
And then Aaron's authority is reaffirmed through the staff.
Yeah.
As they gather one from everybody that's a chieftain, and who's the one that blooms. And not only blooms, but it produces almonds, right? So it sprouts, produces blossoms, and then it bore almonds. And so again, Aaron is, reaffirmed by God as being his chosen high priest.
And here's something that's a physical object that stayed around for a long time. And I mean, it says it is to be a sign, a sign against or for the rebellious children. And then the result is that there be an end of their murmuring against me, and that they do not die. So if you had any sense, you'd look at that rod and you'd learn the lesson and not question God.
Yeah.
Or God's people, Moses and Aaron.
Well, and with the last few minutes we have remaining, I guess it's again good to see that now that Aaron has been sort of reaffirmed as the high priest, God now speaks to him directly. One of the only couple of times that this happens, where Moses apparently is not around and God is speaking directly to Aaron, as chapter 18 opens.
Yeah, there's only, as far as I know, if I remember from the notes, 2 places. One is back there in chapter 10 with the death of Aaron's sons, where he talks to him about, I think, the don't drink strong drink or wine while you're serving as a priest. And then here, where is this one? 18:1 or something?
Yeah, this is 18:1.
And that's really interesting. I mean, you would think God spoke to Aaron about as much as he spoke to Moses, but he's always speaking to Moses. And he tells Moses, tell Aaron. And that's also interesting in light of the background at the burning bush. You remember when Aaron says, I'm not a good speaker, and God says, well, you carry Aaron, he'll be your mouthpiece. And so God speaks to Moses, and Moses speaks to Aaron.
Well, just a couple of points as we end. One is that, God's given him the priesthood, as a gift, and expected, not just you got to do it out of obligation and serve, but this really wasn't an honored privilege to be able to serve. And I think there's admonition here that, treat it the right way.
Yeah, when I read that, just real quick, and this may be more preacher talk than anything, but when I read that verse 7, is it verse 7?
Yeah.
18:7.
Yes.
That I'm giving you the service of the priesthood as a gift. And then I thought, there's the priesthood of all believers, and we are all priests, and it is it's honored privilege that we have to be priest and to offer sacrifices, thanksgiving, the fruit of our lips. And so God tells, and it also I think is a warning to Aaron and to other priests. Don't elevate yourself. It's a gift I'm giving to you, and that's something I think that we should take seriously as well.
And it is an everlasting covenant, and interestingly, God uses the idea of salt, and calls it in verse 19, this gifts, all the gifts that are given to the priest, to Aaron and his sons. And we're not going to read all that. We don't have time. Plus, we've looked at it in other contexts. But here's all the things that are given because they are priests, and it's going to be an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for you and your offspring as well. And again, it's this idea of salt being sort of symbolic for the permanence of the covenant is I think quite interesting, particularly as we see, how salt's used throughout Scripture, and then this idea of priesthood and that sort of thing. I do like how that comes together.
Yeah, the rabbis view it as a preservative, and it's emphasizing the permanence. May I make an amendment of a statement that I made as I look at verse 20 of 18, which is actually the beginning of the next Parsha? I said that God spoke to Aaron 2 times. Well, there's at least a third time in verse 20 there, 18:20. So you have 18:1 and you have 18:20. But it's not over a handful of times that he speaks to him. And it is significant, I think, each time he speaks to him. So
Absolutely. Well, that ends our time together studying this Parsha, and we're grateful that you once again joined us, and thank you for your comments and participation, and we appreciate that very much. And hopefully we didn't rush through it too much, but again, even looking at it from a standpoint of a story that we might have heard a lot, I thought there were some good, interesting, and new things that we can take a look at and ponder, and really kind of, particularly everything from, following on the heels of lusting of the eyes and the heart, to the idea of priesthood being us and being permanent. I think those are all things we can spend some time.
yeah, and I'd say it basically comes out of pride and wanting to put ourselves first. That's what Korach wanted, and that's constant danger for us as well. Many passages go against that. Do we have anybody that needs to say anything before we close?
I appreciate the comments from our teachers. You brought some things to mind I never thought about, and I have read the Bible.
Yes, I know you have. Thank you, James. Well, again, we appreciate you all being here, and we know it's a sacrifice, but it's encouraging to us, and we appreciate you being with us. Chris, I'm going to ask you to lead the closing prayer.
Sure. Let's bow. Our most loving and gracious Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to you for being God, being the only true God, being everlasting, but being merciful and powerful and forgiving and loving and almighty. Father, we see that in your scriptures, and we're blessed to be able to study them, and we're grateful we have opportunities like this to come together to do so. Thank you so much really for Ben and his preparation and his years of learning, and for everybody who's a part of our class who wants to know more about what you have to say to us. Thank you. We ask a blessing upon everyone here, and even those who are not, but who be listening. Please be with us all. Shower us with your love and mercy. Show us how to better serve you and to be part of the calling that you have given to us. Father, it's in the power of your Son's name that we offer this prayer. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chris. Hope everybody have a good rest of the week. And so thanks again for being with us. We'll see you next week.
See you.